Hello, my name is Andrew Keane. Welcome to Keane on America, the daily show about everything that matters, with the world's leading commentators and thinkers. We are still at DLD 2026 in Munich. It's always nice to run into old friends. Kenneth Cukier is one of my oldest tech friends, a guy who's really been around the block many times.
I'm not that old.
You're not that old, Ken?
Not that old. I emphasize
You're younger than me.
but
You're actually significantly younger than me,
Yeah,
which
thank
is
God.
rather embarrassing. Especially given all your achievements. You're the author or co-author of the New York Times best-selling book, Big Data. You work now at The Economist. You have worked at the Wall Street Journal, so you know your tech, Ken, as much as anybody. Let me begin with a question that you and I have often discussed informally. There seems to be an obsession these days with the idea that we're living in unusual times, that there's something different about the moment we're living in. Do you think that's true?
Yes. So the old-timers, or other people who like to pretend they're old-timers, like to say, no, what was unusual was that weird period between the end of the Cold War and 2015, or that period between Carter and Clinton, or the post-war era, the Steven Pinker-esque argument of the post-Cold War, well, the Cold War era and then the post-Cold War era, in which we had global prosperity and peace, and there was not conflict, and there was a rules-based order, and we built these international institutions. And they're not wrong. That is true. So in some ways, we're going back to the past. We're going back to normalcy in great power politics and in might makes right and in tyranny. And you can point back to Rome, or you can point back to Sparta or Byzantium. But I don't think that's really the metric. And why I say this is unusual and this is atypical is because we're in the midst of a collapse. We're actually witnessing a very quick fraying of something that had been built up. It takes a long time to create, the Vatican or a beautiful monument, and it could be obliterated within seconds. In this instance, we're seeing it happen both, slowly and suddenly, both short and fast, and so what we're noticing right now is the fast, whether it is the first year of the Trump administration or the first 2 weeks of 2026. Something that was precious, that took us centuries to build, the concept of human dignity, tolerance, pluralism, democracy, rights, political rights, legal rights, human rights, always honored and honored in the breach, always fragile and always having to be built up, like a garden always tended to. And that's not now decaying, it's actually being murdered, it's being killed actually by the very institutions and roles of the entities that had originally built it. So it is a radical change and a departure. As one final point on that, I was at a dinner in which a woman of a very eminent German family, and she is a woman of a certain age, explained that in the early 1930s, her grandfather created a newspaper in Munich with a co-founder that as soon as the Nazis took power, one of the first things they did is shot one of the co-founders dead. Her father was imprisoned. Her grandfather, and her grandmother went to 4 different prison camps, concentration camps in Germany, but it was liberated by the Americans after the war. She thought it was remarkable that her family was able to survive at all. They refused to go alongside with Hitler. And now she can't believe the fact that it's America that is actually eroding the rules-based order.
I think it was Hemingway, Ken, who famously wrote that you go bankrupt. Someone in one of his stories, someone was asking about how you go bankrupt, and the response was first slowly and then suddenly. Is that what's happening today in terms of this great collapse, this disruption? And if it is, why didn't we notice the slow stuff? We notice the immediacy. It's rather like a bankrupt. they forget that they're going bankrupt slowly, and then of course when it happens, it's very dramatic.
Yeah, I think it's partially it's a cognitive bias in human nature, but it's not unrealistic, or it's not improper either. No one wants to be a soothsayer and try to predict the future with perfect accuracy. So when you're going bankrupt slowly, you don't actually know you're going bankrupt. That term is only applied in hindsight after you've already filed for Chapter 11. Before that, it's just let's make the best that we can when we know that things are flagging, when things are lagging, and we need to sort of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and sort of redouble our efforts. That's all it is. Things are still pretty good. I mean, there's a lot of companies right now that are making profits, but less profits, or they've taken a loss, but they're still have large market caps and solid management teams and investors. So that famous aphorism in The Sun Also Rises is very appropriate for the democratic institutions, because we now are noticing, it's like oxygen. We take it for granted until we don't have it. When we're asphyxiating and holding onto our throat and we cannot breathe, that's when we recognize the value of it. So sadly, I think that's the same thing with not just democracy is only a word, but it comes with a whole accoutrement of other institutions and values and frameworks. We don't live in a democracy, we live in a liberal democracy. Liberalism is antithetical to democracy. The two things are in tension. Democracy is simply rule, aside from the institutional protections of a democracy, it's ruled by the majority. Liberalism is protecting the minority. It's saying there's some basic elements of rights that can't be removed regardless of whoever's in power. It's the liberalism, which comes from liberty and freedom. It's the liberalism which is in jeopardy. Democracy, well, you could argue we have too much of the democracy. We're just flapping in the winds by whoever wins an election here or there.
We began this conversation, I asked you whether we're living in exceptional times, and you said we are. But where are we then in this cycle, the Hemingway-esque cycle of, I don't know, political bankruptcy, or whatever you want to call it? Has it happened yet, Ken?
And that's the interesting thing. No, it hasn't. I think a lot of people are in hysterics or just simply don't know what to do. They're paralyzed. And I think what's happened is it's almost like a Schröderian state, a quantum state where the cat is alive and dead. In this instance, it's as if we're carrying a beautiful Ming vase of priceless value, and we've dropped it. But it's not yet shattered. It's only falling. And the question is, well, what do we do? Right? Can we throw ourselves and our bodies underneath it in time to protect it? Maybe, fracturing our shoulder in the process, but doing it to save this beautiful thing from shattering? Or will we, with an inattention, just let it shatter? Or will we try and fail? But what's important is that just as energy can be in its latent form or kinetic form, active energy, it's actually happening, and latent, which is it's stored, so too, we are in a period of latent harm, not kinetic harm. The seeds of damage has been sown terribly. We're seeing small little sparks and flares of the problem, but calamity has not happened. So I do believe that there is time of people of goodwill to come together to find a way to staunch the erosion, maybe try to buttress what's working, and then hopefully the storm clouds will dissipate and we'll have sunnier days. We're going to have to build something different and new. We can't go back to the past. You never can. But what we hopefully can't do is let what is in the process of eroding and in the process of being obliterated to actually disappear.
We're in Germany, the home, the fatherland of the philosophy of history. It sounds to me, in the way you're interpreting our troubling times, is you still believe in human agency. There's nothing inevitable then about the collapse of everything that's valuable. Is that what you're suggesting?
Completely. I mean, it's funny. The person who didn't believe in human agency was Marx. So I guess you'd say I'm not a Marxist, to pick up your metaphor.
Or a Hegelian, of course, and Marx learned everything, at least about history, from Hegel.
So let's get to Hegel in a second. So what Marx thought that there was an inevitable trajectory to history, and that it was all about economic relations. And I don't think that there's any inevitability to history, and I don't think it's only about economic relations. I think it's about other relationships as well. Economics is one of them. But if we want to pick up, obviously, Marx's mentor Hegel, let's go there and say, if we're in a Hegelian moment, and maybe that's the right metaphor, then we had the thesis of, we'll call it the liberal Carter to Clinton, Kennedy to Carter to Clinton order, then expressed by the grandeur of the Obama years, where you have a black American who's first generation, well, if you're not really first generation, but actually of African parentage, who goes to Harvard Law School, the bastion of elitism. So I think the head of the law review there, which is very prestigious as well, who then has a name that almost sounds like Osama bin Laden, and in fact, the terrorist, and then of course becomes president of the United States. It's so improbable. And if that's the thesis, then the antithesis, the antithesis, is, in the Hegelian sense, is Trump. Right? It's the apex and the nadir, maybe, if that's the metaphor that you want, of a wave. So what is the synthesis from that? What is going to come? What will be born? What either ugly beast or beautiful flower might bloom? It's us to determine the thorn or the flower from the synthesis of these two forces.
As you know, Ken, we can't go back, although many want to. There's a great deal of nostalgia, I think, particularly amongst progressives, but I think you and I certainly agree on that one. You and I also share an interest in technology. We've written books, many books about tech. How can tech play a role in inventing something new rather than simply going back? What is the role of technology in your Hegelian synthesis? What can the role of technology be?
Well, let me caution it by first saying I think there's a risk by doing what Evgeny Mozarov cautioned against, which being a tech solutionist, by saying whatever the problem is, let's see how technology can solve it or mitigate it. And that leads us into a form of thinking that's not very useful. In this instance, if it's about human rights, although we can probably find a technical solution, it might just be a more simple solution, which is to say if a federal agent takes out a firearm and shoots a U.S. citizen, that there's a mandatory federal investigation of it. The person doesn't necessarily go to jail. That's why there's an investigation, because if there's enough evidence to bring charges, the person goes to trial and then is defended by a counselor. And it's just those basic procedural rights and protections that would be needed, and you don't need technology for it. In fact, we already have the technology, if you will, in that metaphor of paper laws, promulgated, and institutions of the judiciary to manage that. But there could be technological solutions, if you will, to that as well. So, for example, one would be that in any instant, all encounters with federal agents are going to be recorded, and so maybe that would be certified in a way that would be automatically brought to evidence and automatically brought into an ombudsman who would be able to adjudicate it. That every time a firearm is fired, you'd be able to record it. What a lot of people don't appreciate is that when you add a microchip, an internet connection, and software to something, you change that thing. And by changing it, you're going to be collecting data, and you can use that data for valuable purposes. In this case, tracking what's happening and then having accounting for it.
You quoted Morozov on his technological solutionism, and I take your point. But on the other hand, many progressives have written off technology entirely. In fact, they see it as the problem, in some ways a more daunting problem than right-wing populism. Coming back to the question, you noted that we can't go back to Ken, and I'm not forcing you to become a technological solutionist, but in a broader sense, AI, which is really changing the world for better or worse, how can AI play a role in reinventing a new world perhaps of rights and law in the 21st century that's different from the thing that's being smashed, or at least seems particularly fragile at the moment, this crown jewel, the vase that we're all trying to avoid smashing?
So it's a very good question, and thank you for pressing me on it. Let me give you two answers. The first part of the answer is going to be that the institutions that I find so precious and valuable that I want to restore are, if you will, not theoretic, but they're form, not content. What I mean by that is I want free and fair elections, but it doesn't say how those elections are held, right? Should 4 years be the right time frame, or was that an artifact of the transaction costs in 1776 when the revolution took place, and then 1789 when the Constitution, or rather 1779 when the Constitution, that's the wrong date either, around 1780 or so, when the Constitution was established. So the point is that many of the features of democracy that we point to today that we like are also artifacts of a different era of technology, where publishing information was costly and laborious, and it was hard to disseminate, and that's now gone away. Where managing an election was very, very difficult, and you needed all these different security protocols for it. But there's more security in our iPhone than there are in our election systems. Insofar, there's facial recognition that the iPhone knows who I am, because it's also my healthcare records and my bank account. But in the voting booth, it doesn't have some of those features. So imagining in this instance that you could have voting being done by phone. You could identify that the person is rational, that they're not drunk. You could have them vote 3 times over the course of 2 days, so it's not an impulse version. How we implement it is really secondary from the principle, which is to say, maybe we should be having a lot more plebiscites, what we want to do, and voting not just simply on binaries, yes or no, but ranked choice. This or this or this or this, so you can choose from a basket of options, not just 1 or 2. The 1 or 2 option made a lot of sense when you had to put a simple bean, for example, into a jar on the left or on the right, but now you can do a lot more because you have the technology to do that. So I think technology can change how we implement the institutions or the principles of liberal democracy.
Just to jump in before you get to some other issues, you bring up plebiscites. We're talking in Germany. You had that interesting conversation last night about the collapse of democracy in Weimar Germany. Much of it seemed to reflect the plebiscitary nature of German Weimar democracy. You're in the UK. The Brexit plebiscite might not have undermined British democracy, but it certainly wasn't its finest moment. So I'm guessing, Ken, you're not a big fan of plebiscites, are you? Do you think that new technology plus more direct democracy, is that a solution, or might that actually deepen the problems with democracy?
The answer is yes to both, or maybe to both. So let's look at it and think and find out what's rational. So in the case of the Brexit vote, what we could have done is have a staggered vote and say, well, first nobody knew what they were voting for. It was either in or out, but many people were saying that out meant a soft Brexit, or we're still part of the customs union, versus a hard Brexit. We have no relationship to the EU whatsoever, and it throws into question NATO. Right? So no one really knew what they were voting for. So under the model I'm suggesting is you would actually be able to have much more granularity into what you're choosing. Secondly, it's all about how you structure it. So in the case of Donald Trump's election in 2016, he lost the popular vote, but he won enough states that he won the Electoral College. Right. So if you had changed the nature of the election of how elections would be won and lost in America, how you design the rules around it, so you could come up with a different outcome. So too with Brexit, many plebiscites are done on a staggered basis, that you have to revalidate the vote, or it's an informational vote. In the French presidential elections, there's multiple rounds. The first round you vote your heart. The second round you vote your head. Hence, you could have Front National getting a very high score in the first round and then losing dramatically to Jacques Chirac in the second round. Let me take one step further, more into a sci-fi nature of how technology can play a role in how we design the world of tomorrow. So everyone's talking about defense tech, right? And it's a very simple idea that you take military weapons, you add artificial intelligence, and you make them much more lethal and much more capable to do more damage. Okay, and so that's the trajectory that most of the world's armies are in. But I think that although it's very easy to make that connection between, military weapons, new technology, stronger weapons, we're all missing a tick. And there's another way to think about it. Why not apply this technology into what I'll call peace tech? Or if you will, can you encode the Geneva Conventions into military equipment so that the drone knows if the person is wounded and therefore hors de combat, outside of combat and not fired on, that the person is surrendering and therefore if it's a legitimate surrender, the drone can accept the surrender and tell the person how the person can drop his armaments and go to the area where he can be picked up by the opponent's soldiers. If the drone can identify with the geolocation sensor that it has anyway, that it's going into a civilian area, it doesn't do damage to the civilian area, which is one of the principles of the Geneva Convention, distinction, but actually only stays in the area of the theater of combat. These are the sorts of things that we can imagine if we were to take the technology that we already have and the extraordinary lethality that it will have and to impose what we've already agreed on. The most signed treaty in international relations is the Geneva Convention, and take the legal code and translate it into software code. And why that's so important is that the days of soldiers fighting soldiers on the battlefield will be as archaic as riding a chariot. In the future, it's going to be machines killing other machines. And unless they understand what the rules of engagement are and how humans have tried to create a humanity even amid the barbarity of war, then we're really lost. So we need to hopefully put in the best principles of our better angels of our nature even into our military weapons.
Ken, you and I are talking in Germany, in Munich, at the DLD conference. Lots of doom and gloom here amongst many of the people I've talked to about the continual decline of Europe, its failure to come up with a dominant AI company to certainly compete with the US and increasingly China. You're an American living in London. You're a keen observer of both sides of the Atlantic. Is what your idea, for example, of incorporating human rights into defense tech, is that the kind of contribution, the European contribution, which can build this new world that you're imagining? We can't quite see it, but we know it's inevitable, for better or worse. We haven't seen it. We barely even can see the coast, but we know it's there. You're somewhere between Europe and America, like me. Have the Europeans and indeed the North Americans got it wrong in terms of imagining that Europe either has to be like America or be irrelevant?
So I ask myself that same question. I don't know for sure. I like to think that Europe can play a distinctive role, and that role can be based on ethics and rights, and that this idea of encoding the Geneva Conventions into military equipment is one example of that. I also believe that you could imagine a world in which Europe can stand alone, apart from the United States. It can work with the United States where it can and wants to, but it can also be a separate entity that stands up on its own. Right now it can't. Certainly in defense it cannot whatsoever. But with all the words coming out of Washington about trying to take over Greenland, as ridiculous as that seems to the ear in early 2026, one imagines that actually probably needs to be the conversation that European governments need to have to each other very quickly to see, well, how can they stand up? How can they imagine international order with America on the other side of their buttress? So can you imagine a NATO that has America as a participant in certain domains, but NATO as a stronger institution only as a European one? That's happened before, by the way, but it was France that was outside of certain dimensions of NATO, but not 100% outside of the whole overarching structure. They wanted their own nuclear weapons in, I guess it was the 60s or so. And so therefore, and America was uneasy with that. But France wanted its own sovereignty. They had the troisième voie, the third way. So I think we need a new form of third way, although I wouldn't use that terminology, to find a way for Europe to stand stalwart as a pole star in international relations, to preserve that precious Western civilization, if you will. And if you were to define what I mean by that, it would be the concept of political pluralism and individual rights.
To what extent, though, is Europe in danger of becoming a museum, quite literally, in the sense that increasingly its economies seem to be dependent on tourism, and a museum to these values, unless it gets its economic act together, particularly on the technology front?
Yeah, that is exactly the challenge. That is exactly the challenge. In fact, you can't walk through the European capitals without thinking, it's a pretty nice museum, but what's happening here? And the answer is not a whole lot, right, when it comes to economic activity. Part of that is, I think, a population that's a little bit too comfortable. I think that's a cultural problem in which they don't value success. They tax it into oblivion. There is not the get up and go and sort of this sort of sunny, almost unrealistic, but very valuable optimism. I see that in my own beloved institution, where I'm very much the American amid a lot of other John Teal, Europeans who, I see the world as a blank
slate.
Very
different from Peter Thiel.
Exactly.
John Teal.
I see the world as a blank slate that I can dab my fingerprint on and change the world and put a dent into the universe. We can do this, because we have the intellect and the ability and we can, storm the hill, take the citadel. And others are like, well, we should be more cautious. We should, why don't we take some time and reimagine this? We should study it. That's too much of an expense. I don't think we want to take the risk on that. And I say, of course you should. There's ways to go with abandon. And I'm very much the penultimate American in that sort of scenario. So too, I think that Europe definitely needs to have more vim and verve, and hopefully they will see the Ukraine war as a focusing moment to realize they have to change their practices.
Speaking of that vim and verve, Ken, you and I have been coming to DLD for many years. Every year there are warnings about European lack of competitiveness and this growing gap between the US. Now, of course, you've got the China card, which changes everything. At what point does it become too late? At what point is the horse already bolted and the game, excusing these rather vulgar metaphors, at what point is the game really over for Europe? It's
getting close, right? We're past 11 p.m., right? We're 3 minutes to midnight, right? I mean, I think we underestimate the fact that Europe is now, at least Europe is now talking about it. I mean, they've talked about it for a while, but there was the Mario Draghi report about 2 years ago, but not much has happened.
Which gets quoted endlessly at events like this.
It gets quoted, but at this point, you just have to shut up, and people need to take money and put it in there. And there's a role for government, right? All you do have to say is that pensioners can take at least 50% of their pensions and put it into and invest it into equity markets in Europe, in their national markets, and then the capital gains from it will be tax-free or will be taxed at 5%. And a lot of people will say, well, that's better than I can get by just parking it into a safe, deposit box, or a bond in my retirement. Anyway, if they're not even making the decisions, their asset managers are doing it for them, and give them free financial advice for that. Maybe even find a way to limit the downside if that's the case. But you'd be freeing up trillions of dollars of capital overnight if this was done European-wide. So public policy actually, and that's just one of maybe, and I've just come up with on the spur of the moment when you've asked, but that's one of 1,000 different policy initiatives and activities that you can do. Asset managers can actually start that process as well. You can imagine tailored products that will go into European industrial might. There's lots of things that could happen, but it's not happening at this point. We need real leaders, and if we're not going to find them in the political sphere, and I don't see them at all in the political sphere, we've got to find them somewhere else. So it's got to be probably in the private sector or in the civil society sector to stand up and say, hey, Europe, this is really important. I've seen that actually at DLD. I am impressed by the business leaders here. I actually see it at Davos, dare I say the word, because it sounds like one's an elitist. But I've seen serious European business leaders who want to do more and are aghast at the state of the world. And so I think they're there, but there's no media to give them exposure anymore. The media is totally collapsed for the most part. The public doesn't even care about these things. They're not even paying attention. They're too busy on their iPhones and looking at Instagram. And we are in a form of civilizational collapse by inattention. As Arnold Toynbee said, civilizations aren't killed, they commit suicide. That's where Europe is right now. It needs to wake up and get its act together.
And much as it might not be particularly palatable to you and I, and perhaps much of our audience, if it's going to come politically in Europe, Ken, isn't it going to come from the right rather than the left?
It may, but I don't think they have the right answers. If the right is just simply a smokescreen for racism and for the denial of rights of others, that's a big problem. So I think that hopefully it's going to come not from the right or the left, but the center, the sort of the silent center, the silent majority, well, I'll call it the reasonable or of center, the sensible center, that comes in and says, hey, like Talleyrand after the revolution, the idea was that the national interest of France doesn't matter. It doesn't change depending on who sits on the throne. So too, there's a basis of commonality, of interest, whether you're on the right or the left, to what it means to run a country and be a part of Europe. And we need to focus on that commonality and develop that, rather than play to the extremes, the far left or the far right, because we're losing the center and we need to rebuild it.
And what happens if none of this happens? It's likely, I think, that it won't. As you said, it's 3 minutes to midnight, and they've had all day to get their house in order. They haven't. Then what happens if the vase smashes, Ken? In Europe.
Yeah, so in Europe, the vase smashing means that that a lot of public services will be discontinued because they'll realize they can't afford it. It'll go to people who can document that they are have been part of the country for a longer period of time. So recent immigrants will probably lose their status for social services, maybe even lose their status to live in that country. In the 20th century, my grandfather was born in Poland. He moved to France and was a student at the Sorbonne. He married a French woman. He was very proud to become to be a French resident. He served in the French army, and as a condition of doing so in the 20s, he became a French citizen. And in the 30s, France revoked his citizenship. That was essentially creating him as a stateless person. He was luckily able to escape to New York with my father and my grandmother. So does that mean that we're going to be revoking citizenship of recent immigrants, people who don't look like us, in Europe? I am not here to say that we will not. I think we're in a period in which things are so erratic, anything can happen. And so I don't want to take that chance. I think you're gambling. When you're gambling global order, you're also gambling the lives of individuals and people. Obviously, the cliche is, one death is a tragedy and 1 million is a statistic. But the Soviet Union imprisoned millions of people. In China, millions of people died of famine, preventable famines. And we look around and we don't see the ghosts of those people. But we should. We have to run the counterfactual in our mind and see all of the innovations were lost and all the beauty that was lost and all of the other souls that were lost because of those preventable deaths. And I fear that the vase breaking, that smashing, means that there's going to be a sort of a unitary sense, a totalizing sense of what it means to be Dutch or French or German or Italian at the expense of anyone that doesn't look like us. We will no longer have a pluralistic sense of our shared humanity, but only one that looks more tribal of who we are. And I think that's going to be a rougher world, and one that we don't want to live in, but like oxygen, we can't imagine what it's like to live without, so we take it for granted.
The Dutch, French, English journalist Simon Cooper writes for the Financial Times. That's a quintessential European, has written that we're already at that point where more and more people coming to Europe won't get citizenship. It's becoming more and more like the Gulf, where they may have the right to work. in Germany or France or Holland or the United Kingdom, but they won't get citizenship. So for people like Cooper, the vase, in a sense, is already broken.
No, I would disagree with that. I mean, if you're telling me that the legitimate political authority has decided through the political process to change the rules, the legal rules by which people can come into that country, and they're abiding by those rules of law, right? That sounds totally fine. People can make a decision for themselves whether they want to go to Amsterdam and work or they want to stay somewhere else. And I think that has always been the conundrum of the 20th century, that if you're going to have a generous welfare state, it's going to be hard to have open borders because you're going to have a lot of people coming in and availing themselves of the benefits of that, but have not paid into it over the course of decades, if not centuries, through all of the institutional practices, as well as fighting and dying in the country's wars to preserve the democracies that they now are benefiting from. So if you're operating under the rule of law and you change the laws, people have a form of volition that they can choose how they want to exercise their lives. So that to me is not a problem. That's fine. What I am uneasy with is when we're abrogating the rule of law, when there's political leaders who are taking centuries of practices, or certainly decades of practices, and just unitarily ripping it up. That's a problem.
Finally, you were supposed to cheer me up, Ken. You were talking about reinventing a new world, and it's a very bleak picture that you paint. Let's end on a positive note. It's 3 minutes to midnight in Europe, maybe in the world. Let's end on a couple of preliminary things that can be done to begin to change the course of history, so it doesn't seem as inevitably dark and apocalyptic as some people imagine. What can happen? Next time, next year when we meet in Munich at DLD, what could be done to at least cheer things up a little bit?
So what could happen is a sense that if we're seeing the dismantling of I'll call it the Gladstonian state, and what I mean by that is Gladstone was the prime minister that in the 1800s created the modern state or the Franklin D. Rooseveltian state that does things for citizens. It's proactive. When it becomes too bloated, it's the nanny state, but it's the government that tries to look out after people and do the best for them. Now, I think that was the right thing to do, and it's certainly the right thing to do in the 1800s, particularly before there was the franchise for all individuals. Working men couldn't, because the working class didn't have the time to become learned. They weren't literate, but then they were literate, and so eventually then it wasn't women, and then women had the franchise, but it wasn't until like 1972 or 1974 in Switzerland before women could vote. But the point is that if we're seeing the dismantling of the idea of the nation state that works for its citizens and provides these services, that those activities are taken up by private institutions. The birth of the modern charity was and the philanthropy was born of the idea that there needed to be institutions in society to do things for other people, because society was becoming very wealthy, but there was a growing underclass that was going to ruin it, because you were having an individualized profit and benefit and a public sphere that was immiserated. And so we're having that same issue now. So what will be the probably national philanthropies or international ones, and the institutions that will say, as the state retreats from things like the USAID, right, or the Institute for Peace and the Institute for Democracy, that will have private institutions step forward, so the anti-Peter Thiels and the anti-Elon Musks will go forward and say, hey, we're going to put a lot of money behind this. Bill Gates is doing the Gates Foundation, saying, hey, if we're going to lose PEPFAR, which is going to be giving HIV drugs to Africans, we're going to have a private institution of philanthropy that's going to step and fill the gap. So we need more of that, and I think that might be a way in which we can have global solidarity and liberal values, but not through the institution of the Westphalian nation state. And that actually might be an improvement.
Well, we shall see. Ken Cukier, as always, an honor, pleasure. I will see you certainly this time next year in Munich, but hopefully before then. Thank you so much.
Thank you.